Okay, now we're going to talk about these Moses tests. This is something that came up with years ago and put into the R version of E&M tools, but never actually written a paper on. Moses, this is an acronym that Rob Landfair came up with, stands for Model Selection for Ecological Similarity. And on the surface of it, this is very much like a sort of parametric modeling version of something like the identity test or the background test. But I think it's actually more than that. It's also a different kind of approach to joint species distribution modeling than people are doing elsewhere. So let me just walk you through the idea here. So we're going to go over to the BAM diagram, Sobron-Peterson, this idea that there is this kind of abiotic niche, this subset of an environment space within which our species is happy. And let's say we're working on some sort of question where this is the main thing we want to know. As Soberon and Peterson pointed out, we've got biotic interactions that restrict our species to a subset of the space that would otherwise be suitable for it. So, this is where it could live, all other things being equal, but with biotic interactions, it can only live here at this intersection. And then even that sort of area of environment space where it could live given biotic interactions, there may only be a subset of that it can disperse to, right? And so where our species can actually be found is the intersection of the abiotically and biotically suitable places that it can actually get to. So this is the thing we want to know, and our data will be sampled essentially from this region of environment space. All right, so that's problematic, and it places fundamental limits on how well we're going to be able to infer this niche that we actually want to know something about. So, what can we do? Well, we can actually incorporate just the fact of evolution and the idea of niche conservatism. So let's say we could get nature to tell us that two closely related species actually had identical abiotic fundamental niches. Well, that's interesting from a niche evolution point of view, but it's also potentially an extremely valuable piece of information because one of those two species will have some biotic interactions and a dispersal limitation that sort of restrict it to a subset of its abiotic niche, and that other species may have a very different set of biotic interactions and dispersal limitations that limit it to a different subset of the abiotic niche. So if we somehow magically knew that even though these two species live in different areas of environment space, they actually their fundamental niches are the same, we would know that this is a very incomplete picture of the niche for species 1, and this is a very incomplete picture of the niche for species 2. And if we combine them to build a model, we would actually get a much better estimate of the fundamental niches of those two species than we ever could by modeling either of them alone. So if we knew the niche was conservative, we could actually use the fact of evolution to get a much better niche estimate. And this is actually potentially really important. Let's think about a situation like this, where we've got Cloud Island species. So we've got 4 little made-up species of gecko here, and they live on 4 different mountains. And since I'm just making this up, I'm going to tell you they all have the exact same fundamental niche. They are allopatric on these different mountains for historical reasons, right? So these are, Cloud Island species, for instance. But there's an environmental gradient, because there's always an environmental gradient. And so even though they have the same fundamental niche, Gecko A lives down at this end of this environmental gradient. Gecko B lives further along. Gecko C lives further along. Gecko D lives further along. So they have the same fundamental niche, but quite different realized niches due to this sort of historical allopatry. What happens if we build models for these species based on their present occurrences without taking that evolutionary history into account? Well, this is the fundamental niche, this black thing here is the fundamental niche of all 4 of these species. Whereas these blue, red, yellow, and purple things, these are the realized niches of these species. And if we build models based on a species' current distributions, our models are going to end up looking a lot like the fundamental niche here, right? The realized niche here. So, our model for our blue species will say that it can only live on the blue mountain, and our model for our red species will say it can only live on the red mountain, and the model for etc. Right? Which is fine if your question when you go out modeling is where can I go and find my species tomorrow, right? In that case, this model is better than the one that actually encapsulates the entire fundamental niche because it tells you exactly where to go and look for your species. Similarly, a red species, yellow species, purple species, if your goal is to estimate your species distribution, then these realized niche-oriented models are exactly what you want. But what if you're using these models to predict the effects of climate change? And what if climate change changes where those mountaintops are in environment space? So suddenly you've got one of those mountaintops here in environment space. That's really problematic because now you've got a set of models that say that this little region of environment space isn't suitable for any of your species, when in fact that region of environment space is suitable for all of your species. So we're going to get models that say our species is going to, go extinct or whatever, based entirely on the fact that we've modeled the realized niche with sort of no knowledge of niche conservatism and no desire or no attempt to sort of incorporate that into our modeling process. So we could potentially make disastrously wrong conservation decisions by failing to take that evolutionary history into account. Whereas if we had somehow known that these species actually all shared the same fundamental niche and we combine their data, we might make a model that actually got it right. So we could potentially get this wrong or right based on whether or not we do multi-species modeling that takes niche conservatism into account. And so this is a little cartoon example, but we've got simulated examples as well where we have a species with a sort of fundamental niche. We put it into a real geographic space, and then we subset its range within that geographic space based on some algorithm, and we build models and all that sort of stuff. So when we subset that the suitable habitat to provide our species range, we can actually do these simulations where we say, okay, the other half of that subset, this bit over here, is actually the range of a sister species. So we have one species here, we have another species there that has the same fundamental niche. And now let's ask the question, what happens when I model this species alone versus these two species together? So here is the truth for both of those species, the true niche. And then this is a single species model for that southern species. It's in southern Victoria and Tasmania. It's a GLM, GAM, BioClim, a bunch of different algorithms here. Some of these, not too bad. Some of these, chaotic and insane. GLM, doing something completely different. Yeah. So what happens if we throw that sister species in and we get essentially a better sampling of the habitats that are suitable for both those species while keeping sample size constant? So we threw away half the data from that southern species and just put in that many data points from northern species. It doesn't even matter which algorithm we use, they all get better. If we can take that niche conservatism into account, our GLMs get better, our GAMs get better, our BioClim models get better, BRTs, random forest maxent domain, they all get better. If you just knew somehow those two species had the same niche and incorporate that into your modeling process. And like I say, we didn't change sample sizes here, right? The massively improved performance of every one of these algorithms is strictly due to a better sampling of the suitable set of environments. Very cool, huh? So that is, like I say, this is a real simulation, so it's not like that cartoon example, but still, this is a case where niche conservatism is complete, where it's perfect. But we don't necessarily need to assume that niche conservatism is perfect for evolution to be helpful in this case. So yes, obviously, evolution is helpful, or pooling species together is helpful when niche conservatism is absolute. But also, I think fairly obviously, it's not very helpful when niche evolution is very fast, so closely related species don't actually contain that much information about species' environmental tolerances. And I don't think there's really a switch here where it goes from helpful to unhelpful to pool species together. I think there's probably some sort of gradient where the slower niche evolution is, the better an idea it is. The faster niche evolution is, the less helpful it is. But that's just me sort of making an argument here. We can actually simulate this. So this is stuff I've done with Nick Matsky, where we sort of simulate niches, as I've kind of shown you there. And then we take the parameters of this fundamental niche and evolve them along a simulated phylogeny. And so we evolve 10 species that have their own niches. And those can be very, very similar if we let the rate of niche evolution be slow, or they can be quite different if we let the rate of niche evolution be fast. And then we give those species different ranges, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we just asked a very, very simple question here, which is, how good a model do I build when I pull this entire clade of 10 species together versus how good of a model do I get when I model each species separately? And here, when I say how good of a model, I mean how accurately do we estimate the true suitability of habitat for our species? How accurately do we estimate the fundamental niche, not just their geographic distributions, right? So the plot I'm about to show you, I don't want to go into what this metric is, but basically everything above the 0 on this axis here is we're better off modeling an entire clade of 10 species together if we want to get the fundamental niche correct. And below the 0 axis is we're better off modeling all 10 separately. And then on the x-axis, we've got the rate of niche evolution. And you can see the rate of niche evolution here, when it's low, we're better off modeling the entire clade together if we want to guesstimate the fundamental niche. And as it gets faster, we're better off separating our species out. And yeah, this is a kind of a complicated metric here, but let me just say that, you know, by the time you get up to 1 here, that means the standard deviation of the Brownian motion model is equivalent to the mean. If I remember correctly, it's been a bit since I did this simulation. It's a pretty fast rate, actually. You have to have pretty fast evolution before you're not gaining something by pooling closely related species together. Again, if your goal is to estimate the niche, not just to estimate the species distribution. So, this is what happens. I mean, we can see there's some value here based on these simulations. This is, you know, tells you that we could do something well here if we knew the truth of rates of niche evolution, if we knew when it was good to pool our species versus treat them separately. It says, yes, we should take that into account and possibly pool species together. How do we know on empirical data? So the approach that we came up with is actually just a model selection-based approach. We treat this as a model partitioning question, where we basically ask how many independent niche models we need to explain the distribution of a group of species. So the demo of this is in GLM, so that's what Moses is running on now. You could easily do this in the context of GAMS, possibly Maxent, but there are, as I mentioned in one of the earlier tutorials, some conceptual issues with using AIC on Maxent. But anyway, yeah, but everything is constrained so that all comparisons are made using the same presence and pseudo-absence data. And so all you do is you build a model for species 1, you build a model for species 2, and you build a model for them to pool together. And it's a little more complex if you're using the small sample size corrected AIC, but if you're just using regular AIC, you can actually just sum AIC values up and ask whether these summed AIC values for these two separate models are greater or less than the AIC value for a model built for the two species together, right? And if this is greater, then you actually prefer the pooled model here. If this is less, then you prefer the separate models. Just remember how AIC works. The lower value is better. So we can do this with real species now. So this is a leaf-tailed gecko. This is the data I'm going to show you is stuff that was graciously loaned to me by Conrad Hoskins and Dan Rosauer. Yeah, so this is these guys live in Eastern Australia. Here's one on me, just chilling. Yeah, and they're actually a lot like that cartoon example I just showed you, where we've got these lizards at the top of different mountains, so they don't really like lowland areas. They like hanging out at the top of mountains. And Dan and Conrad, who are the people who would know, or some of the people who would know, say that these guys actually look superficially pretty ecologically similar. They just kind of live in different places. And so we've got them sort of scattered along the north coast here, with one huge exception, which is this Phylurus platurus, which lives quite a bit further south. That's about where I used to live in Australia. Is much more cosmopolitan and isn't just sticking to the top of hills. It's it just gets around. These things show up in your yard and stuff if you live out in the bush. And so this system we thought was really good as a test case because Dan and Conrad had a pretty good idea of what they thought the answer had to be, which is that these guys are all pretty similar to each other, and Platurus is very weird. And if you sort of plot their occurrences in environment space, you see exactly that. So this is Platurus, and this is all those northern ones, right? And so PC1 obviously is some environmental axis that scales north to south or runs north to south. So maybe it's not too surprising that this separates them out. But but Platurus is definitely somewhere else in environment space than these other ones. But these other ones, there's a decent amount of overlap here between these different species, right? So let's just build models for all of these species separately and then sum their ICs up. So this is essentially what you would do if you didn't try to take evolution into account. You just treat each species as its own entity. You build a model. You ask how well it explains your species distributions. And we get a joint AIC of 420. Cool. What if we just pool all these together, like in our simulation, and just say, okay, what if we just say a Phylurus is a Phylurus is a Phylurus, we model them all together and just treat them as one thing. If our AIC goes down by more than like 2, we will consider this to be a significant improvement. And what we get is what is that, 241? It's a massive improvement in AIC by just pooling the entire genus together, right? So that's interesting. We've actually said, hey, you know what, if we just pretend that no niche evolution has happened in this group at all, we can actually do a much better job of modeling their distributions using simple niche models than we can by modeling each of these things separately and acting like they're a new thing. But that wasn't our hypothesis, right? Our hypothesis was that Platurus here is doing something different from the rest of these species. And it turns out we get a delta AIC of 23. So this was 279, now it's 256. So we get another substantial jump in explanatory power, maximizing the trade-off between explanatory power and number of parameters. We get a massive jump in AIC again by sort of treating Platurus as its own thing and saying, you know what, the rest of these Phylurus are basically doing the same stuff. And this is the hypothesis we thought would get the most support. It did, which is very reassuring. But also it gives us not just an interesting alternative way of answering the evolutionary question about patterns of niche evolution, it actually gives us better models in the process. So here we started with an a priori hypothesis about one species being unusual while the others were more or less interchangeable. What if we don't have that hypothesis? What if we have a phylogeny and we want to just use that to sort of guide the kinds of questions we ask? We can actually do that. So here's a tree for Phylurus, at least these species from the east coast of Australia. And what we can do is we can take the tree and treat it as a nested series of hypotheses about which species should be separated versus modeled together. So here we can say, should Isis and Ossa be modeled separately or together? And the answer we got actually from that was they should be modeled together. And then we can actually move down the tree and say, we can pool Isis and Ossa together and say, should we model this clade separately from this species? And the answer we got was no, actually we're better off modeling this entire clade together. And then we can go down to this next node and say, okay, now we got this clade of 3 that we know is best modeled together. Is this species best modeled on its own, or are we better off folding all 4 of those together, right? And so we can just basically treat a phylogeny as a nested series of hypotheses and work our way down it, figuring out where in the tree we should be partitioning our models. This is, I think, a really valuable thing to do in a system where you don't have a priori hypotheses, but it's worth noticing that doing it this way will not give you kind of a paraphyletic niche, right? It won't, this answer would give you that Platurus and Amnicola should be modeled together and that these guys should be modeled together, when in fact the best answer overall is that Amnicola should be over here. But since we are actually using the tree to guide our hypotheses, the only hypothesis we address with respect to Platurus is, are we better off modeling Platurus with Amnicola? And if the answer is yes, then it gets thrown in with Amnicola anywhere deeper in a tree. So, using the phylogeny to guide hypothesis testing can be very useful. In this particular case, it doesn't get us the optimal results, but it's better than nothing. Yeah, you could also potentially do like some sort of exhaustive search where you tried every possible pairing here, and if you're using a relatively fast modeling algorithm, that's not impossible. Yeah. All right. So that's Moses. That's how it works. I want to make just a general plug for incorporating evolution into niche models and species distribution models. So I had a paper come out about a year ago, I think it was, in Tree with a group of people where we sort of argued that assuming a priori that the species is the appropriate taxonomic scale for modeling is probably actually not getting us the best outcomes. And the cartoon example I gave you before sort of shows why that can be the case. So I think it's a great idea to incorporate these, like this evolutionary perspective into niche modeling. But there's a problem, which is it's a great idea that almost nobody's going to use until our obsession with discrimination accuracy in geographic space is expunged, basically. Because think about what happens. So if I build, let's say Moses is working perfectly, and I build a model for one of those Phylurus, and it uses data points for all those other ones that have effectively interchangeable niches. That model is going to say, okay, my species can live where I've seen it before. It's also going to say it can live on these other mountains where it's never been seen. And that's true in our cartoon example here, right? Our species actually could live on all these mountains, but it hasn't gotten there for historical reasons. So this is the better niche estimate, but it's a terrible distribution estimate, right? Whereas this model, that's just based on the species occurrences and doesn't take niche conservatism and evolution into account, this model is going to be a very good distribution estimate, but will do a very bad job of saying where our species could live that it doesn't currently live. And the issue with discrimination accuracy in geographic spaces, it's always going to prefer this model to this model. It's always going to prefer the model that just fits where your species currently lives. And this doesn't matter if you do it on blocked data or randomly withheld data or anything. Discrimination accuracy is always going to like the answer that matches your species' current distribution best. And that's absolutely valid for some applications, but I would say, as I argued earlier, if we're talking about conservation, if we're talking about paleoclimate modeling, things like this where we're projecting models into other times and spaces, I think this evolutionary modeling approach actually could do a much better job of getting us closer to the kind of niche estimate that we want. There is a lot of work to be done here. I think the future of incorporating evolution, and the present of incorporating evolution into this kind of modeling is really interesting. I think the future is going to be even more so. There's a dozen of the smartest people I know who are working on different methods for doing this. But whether you use Moses for this or not, I think taking an evolutionary perspective is kind of one of the next big steps we can take to make this sort of modeling much more robust and reliable, and make better conservation decisions and a better world.